All right, thank you so much for joining us today for From the Field, Farm Chat with Idaho Wheat. I am Brittany, I'm the Executive Director of the Idaho Wheat Commission, and we are happy to have you. Today we have Adam Ratliff joining us. He is affectionately known on social media as the Armchair Engineer, and he is going to talk about the Snake River dams and why they are important for the Pacific Northwest. This is an interesting perspective that we don't always get because Adam is not directly tied into agriculture, which is who we are usually talking to and with about this dam issue and the dam issue, whichever one, however you want to put the emphasis. That joke just never gets old. Adam, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself, but before you start, I just want to remind anyone on this call that you are free to ask questions at any time. You can do that by unmuting your microphone, using the reactions at the bottom of the screen to raise your hand, or typing your question into the chat, and we'll make sure that that question gets asked to Adam. So Adam, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for having me here. My name is Adam. I'm a filmmaker and content creator based out of Eastern Washington and Northern Idaho. I've lived in the Pacific Northwest my entire life, and I got to take issue to something you said. You said I'm not directly tied to agriculture, but I would say we're all directly tied to agriculture. And the fact that most people don't realize that is kind of the problem. Because as anyone who works in ag knows, when you don't know where your food comes from, you make worse decisions in life and in the voting booth. And I believe that's happening here with issues such as the Snake River dams and with water issues all across the West.
You're right. That is a great correction. Thank you. What I should have said is you're not actively farming.
That is true. That is true.
That's
But
accurate,
I did just buy a place out in the county, and I'm now surrounded by Palouse wheat fields. So I'm getting as close as I can without actually hopping in the combine.
Well, that is a beautiful area.
Yeah.
And thank you for making that distinction, because you're right. Most people don't realize how closely they are tied to agriculture. They have no idea where their food comes from or the ramifications of their decisions. And it is directing us to a mess. So Adam, go ahead and tell us why you chose this platform. Why did you choose to talk about the Snake River dams and educate people about the importance of the dams here in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, thank you. I believe that the Snake River dams represents the single most impactful environmental and economic issue for the entire region, for the entire Pacific Northwest. And it is being largely driven by a side that is not afraid to kind of fudge the facts about what's going on there. The impact of the Snake River dams is enormous. And yet, if you ask the average person on the street about the four lower Snake River dams, specifically Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental, Little Goose, and Lower Grant dams, they will tell you that the dams block salmon migration, which is not true. They will tell you that they produce very little power, which is not true, and that they're old and obsolete, which is definitely not true. They're actually some of the newest dams we have. If you look at the arguments being made, specifically the environmental ones about the Snake River dams, there certainly is a case to be made about dams playing a role in ecological decline. That is definitely an issue. However, the exaggeration is so large, it kind of makes me question the motives of some of the people involved in this, because if you truly did want to restore Snake River salmon, you wouldn't be focused on those four dams. You'd be focused at some other dams and some other habitat restoration. And so my belief is that this really isn't about the lower four Snake River dams. There is an ongoing long-term campaign in the works to persuade the public that it's in their best interest to not just tear out these four dams, but to tear out almost all of them. And we're talking irrigation projects that touch everyone's lives, from the Columbia River to the Snake to the Yakima River, even up to the Middle Snake down in southern Idaho. There are people out there who really believe we would be better off as a society if every river ran free. And that's an interesting value proposition, because we know what life was like back then. We grew a whole lot less food, and we lost a lot more property to flooding. We also didn't have electricity. So, yeah, but this particular conversation has a lot of momentum behind it, largely because no one's speaking up on what I call team sanity. And so I just decided this is a passion. This has always been a passion of mine. I decided I'm going to do what I can to get the word out.
Well, we appreciate that. Just to go back to what you said a minute ago, these dams are old, but they're some of the newest dams we have. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, we have euphemisms for elderly, a woman of a certain age, right? Old when it comes to dams is fairly subjective because the United States essentially stopped building dams in the mid 70s after the collapse of Teton Dam in 1976. And so the last big dam in America was Dvorak Dam in the North Fork of the Clearwater, finished in 74. And I think the lower Snake River dams were finished 73, 74, somewhere in there. So they are new by infrastructure standards, right? The Golden Gate Bridge was built in 1936. So it's new in that regard. In terms of this vital infrastructure, there's some of the newest structures we have. When people say that they're old, I mean, they're not past their useful life, right? Like they have not silted in, they are not in danger of falling over from a heavy rain, like that dam in southern Minnesota that breached just a couple days ago. There's no danger of that. These are dams that are well within their operating life. If anything, they're not even halfway, and so it's kind of uh, an unfair statement to say that they're old just because they predate the end of the Cold War, right? Like there's a ton of infrastructure that we plan to be around for another couple hundred years that falls in that same category.
Right.
Yeah, I'd also like to point out that we have irrigation systems in this country that really are functionally identical since the day they were built, and some of them date back to the Great Depression. And we are still consuming calories that are made as a direct result of that infrastructure. So, I mean, that's one of the great things about water. Water always flows downhill, and so when you're doing water infrastructure, the the software version doesn't matter nearly as much as the hardware. Are you taking good care of the hardware? If it's well maintained, these dams should last 200 to 300 years.
Adam, in viewing some of your posts on social media, you give special attention to the four lower Snake River dams. As you've looked at these and studied these, can you tell us what's unique about the four lower Snake River dams?
There's plenty that's unique, and there's plenty that is boring. And I believe that boringness is why they are kind of a low hanging target for the dam breaching community. It's hard to find structures this large that are this remote. Kathy McMorris Rogers, the congresswoman, she has a Save the Dams campaign. I am fairly certain she has never laid eyes on three of the four of them, just because they're so hard to get to. I mean, it's a 3-hour drive from anywhere, and so they are extremely remote, proportionate to how large they are. When it comes to their design, I mean, they're maybe not the most interesting structures in the world, but the most critical thing about them is that they extend the river transportation corridor from Tri-Cities all the way up to Lewiston, Idaho. That's I think it's something like 250 some river miles. If you were to breach those dams, you would functionally shorten the river highway, officially known as M84, by almost 45% or so. What that does is it diminishes the economic impact of the four dams you leave in place, because every barge that goes through Lower Granite also goes through Bonneville. And so by going after the lower four Snake River dams, you're basically turning your sights on the rest of the dams because you're lowering the value of the river highway as a whole and making it less economically viable to keep maintaining the system. So I believe that this is an incrementalist strategy, and that really we need to look at the system as a whole, the river transportation system as a whole, and recognize the great value it brings, not just for growers, not just for ag, but for everyone who lives in the Pacific Northwest.
In looking at these dams, the four lower Snake River dams, are they affecting the salmon population, and if so, how?
Oh, they absolutely are. They absolutely are. I mean, the river is developed and modified in a way that it would be impossible for it not to affect the salmon. And we know this because we have really good data on this, because the first dam that had fish passage was the lowest dam, Bonneville Dam. So from roughly about 1933 forward, we know 201, how many fish have passed upstream in the Columbia River system. So we could see, okay, when this dam was built, how did that affect the population? When this watershed was cut off, how that affect the population? And so they absolutely are having a not positive effect. The myth, though, is that we used to have this many salmon, then we built the dams and the fish went away. That's the myth, because then by the transitive property, if we remove the dams, the fish will come back. You ask an average person on the street about this, they'll tell you, oh yeah, just a few decades ago, we had millions or billions of salmon coming up into these regions. And we know that's not true. We have the data that shows it, but that is conveniently left out. We know that the collapse of the fishery happened between 1880 and 1920. The era of massive overfishing of the area around Portland, Vancouver. You look at pictures from those days, they were just vacuuming out the river with these enormous fish wheels, these enormous canneries, and also with pollution. We know that's when the population collapsed. And when Bonneville Dam was built in the 1930s, we have a snapshot of what the river population looks like at that time. Since then, it goes up some, it goes down some, like it plays around a little bit, but we have never seen, after World War I, the kind of numbers in the river that Lewis and Clark saw in 1805. When Lewis and Clark came in 1805 and they went past Sligo Falls, they described the migration as being so thick that you could walk across the river, metaphorically, on the backs of the salmon. That's what they saw. And that was gone. That was gone by the time World War II came around. And it had nothing to do with the dams. And so there's this myth that if we breach these 4 dams, the salmon will suddenly come back. And that's not going to happen, which means they'll probably say, well, okay, let's breach another one. Okay, let's go after McNary. Let's go after John Day. Let's go after the Dalles. They just work their way down the river. And, at that point, you may as well go up to Grand Coulee. And so it's that incrementalism myth that we have to bust here. Like, yeah, the salmon are affected, but not in the way that you think.
So you mentioned previously there are other dams that potentially cut off fish migration from their natural habitat.
Not potentially, that do.
That do cut off fish from their natural habitat. Why do you think those dams are not being talked about as much as the focus on the 4 Lower Snake River?
Well, it depends on which hat I'm wearing, right? So there's a number of very well-meaning ecology groups that like to do an annual protest at Lower Granite Dam because it's an easy 45-minute drive from Lewiston. And a couple years ago, they got a projector out and they projected the words "Free the Snake" on Lower Granite Dam in the middle of the night. It was a great photo op. Hats off to them. If they actually cared about salmon habitat, they would have done that on Hell's Canyon Dam via jet boat. But they didn't do that. So that tells me either they don't know where the habitat's actually blocked, unlikely, or they recognize that politically speaking, it's far easier to go after the federally owned Lower Snake River dams than to go after the privately owned Hell's Canyon complex owned by Idaho Power. Idaho Power, I don't want to throw them under the bus, but there is some dubious history about how those dams were constructed and certain requirements for fish passage that were just ignored. It's an interesting bit of history that gets swept under the rug, and it's probably too late to do anything about it right now. But there are dams that cut off fish passage, and we're not talking about them. Instead, we're talking about the dams that have some of the highest survival rates in the entire Columbia Snake Basin. Why is that? That's an intriguing question. I would like to see more people discuss it.
Each of the 4 dams, are they all equipped with the fish ladder?
From day one. And you can go onto the BPA's website and you can actually download the raw data. They have it available in chart form, or you can just say, send me a spreadsheet, and they will give you daily totals since the day that facility opened. You can actually do that for all 8 dams on the Columbia Snake River Highway. And yeah, from day one, it's had upstream passage. The more recent innovation is downstream passage. And that's really something that we only started to understand from a biology standpoint in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s, recognizing that, yeah, the adults are coming upstream to die, but if their descendants don't make it downstream, what's the point, right? And so the assumption was always that there's so much momentum in the river, the juvenile fish, they just get swept downstream, and they do. The problem is there's a lot of things that want to eat them along the way. and the slower water makes them really easy for prey. And so that's something that just really wasn't taken into account when any of these dams were built, including Bonneville in 1936 or Rock Island in 1933 or 1930. And so that's been something that has to continually be worked on. I think they're done with 3 out of 4 upgrading the lower Snake River dams to have advanced downstream passage, which is essentially a collection system attached to a water slide. The juveniles tend to be in the top 6 feet of the water, so they collect them and then send them downstream in a water slide that minimizes the stress on them. And so every year it gets better. Like we're not celebrating the wins with these dams. It's actually amazing seeing how much progress has been made. And quite frankly, if it was any other species, it would be on the cover of a magazine, right? We've had mammals that have been near extinction, or certain avian species have been near extinction that through human intervention have started to come back. We're not celebrating that with the fish runs on the Snake River.
Yeah.
So Adam, I like that analogy of a water slide.
Mm-hmm.
For someone who is not an engineer, can you explain how fish ladders work?
Yeah, no problem. So first it's very important to know that these salmon are not creatures of the river, they're creatures of the ocean. They live 95% of their entire lifespan in the ocean. That's where they get big, that's where they eat, that's where they get eaten by orcas. Like they are marine animals. At the end of their lifespan, instinct kicks in and they want to go back to their place of their birth. Once they enter the river in fresh water, they stop eating, they don't sleep, they just go. They might rest for a little bit, but they just go. And they expend all this energy pushing against the current. They are instinctively looking for the strongest current in the river, so they stay in the middle of the channel, and they're just going to plow upstream until something in their brain says this is the place. And so when they get to a dam, they get confused because there's nowhere to go. So what you do is you simulate a mountain stream for them to swim up. And that usually consists of a pump that pushes water out into the current that they're attracted to, and they swim up the pump. And then once they're inside that chamber, you give them a series of short pools with drops of about a foot each. And it looks like just an artificial mountain creek bed with little mini waterfalls. And they just gradually work their way upstream because, again, they are hardwired to get upstream at all costs. And they will find that ladder one way or another. And then once they're in, they're ascending, no matter what. And so that's how you get fish over a dam. It's been known for well over 100 years. They were building fish ladders before they were building big dams. There were cases where you had a natural obstacle to fish migration. For example, Shears Falls on the Deschutes River. Some locals in Bend decided, hey, we'd really like to get fish above that. So they built a fish ladder around a natural waterfall. and it works. If there's a way for them to push their way upstream, they will find it.
Can you talk a little bit about the downstream bypasses as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we learned in the 90s is that the process of going from a still reservoir above the dam to another still reservoir below the dam, that transition was very violent. And a lot of people were under the impression that the fish were getting chopped up in the turbines. It doesn't happen as often as you would think. They actually put sonar inside the draft tubes and watched to see how many actually got hit by the turbine blades, and it was a ridiculously small percentage. The real danger came when they went through the spillway gates and ended up breathing in all that water that got frothed up. Like the water comes over the gates and it turns white, right? Well, that's putting a lot of air into the water and a lot of dissolved nitrogen, and that dissolved nitrogen is somewhat toxic to the fish. It also dazes them and makes them disoriented, which makes them really easy pickings for seagulls. So, how do you get rid of seagulls? Well, we'll put up some nets and some compressed air guns to scare them off, right? But figuring out the patterns of that downstream passage was really a big win. For example, on the Dalles Dam, they discovered that not only were the fish getting disoriented going over the spillway, but once they were downstream, they got caught in an eddy. And they'd be stuck in that eddy for days and days and days until finally the seagulls ate them all. And so they ended up putting out a concrete weir about 100 feet long that just pushed them back into the channel. You end up seeing like the survival rate triple overnight with just that one little change. And so really it's just helping to facilitate the transition over the dam to make it easier. The most common facility that we've seen built is that water slide concept. They find a collection point, they get them into a tank, and then they put them into a tube about 36 inches in diameter, and it has the laziness of a kid's water slide at a water park. If you look on the side of the dam, you might see a tunnel that does a big serpentine pattern. That's to keep the ride as mild as possible for the juvenile fish. And the survival rate on those is approaching 100%. We know how to get fish over the dams at this point. The thing we haven't solved, though, is how do we help the fish navigate the slack water? Because they are naturally evolved to just be swept downstream in a free-flowing river that usually takes a day. Now they're in a reservoir where they have to swim. That could take a week or two. And so we're still trying to figure that out. And that is a legitimate hit on the salmon population. That is not a good thing. But when you look at all the things that we've solved in the last 30 years, I think it's just a matter of time before we figure out downstream passage to the reservoirs.
So Matthew, what's your message overall? If there was one message that farmers could take away about the importance of the dams and how the dams and the fish can coexist and all of that, what would be that message?
You called out Matthew. Were you mean to call out somebody else?
Oh no, sorry. I was reading the question from Matthew. It's for you, Adam. Sorry.
My message would be, I'm speaking primarily to Idaho farmers, right? I would say whether or not you are actually transporting your product on the M84, this affects everyone. You know, we're seeing in the southeastern part of the state what happens when bureaucrats decide who can turn their wells on and off, right? You know, a very easily solved problem that is just being messed up by people who don't really know that water flows downhill. Don't let the bureaucrats take control of the situation, because they're not just coming after the lower 4 Snake River dams, they're coming after every dam. And that's every irrigation ditch, that's every weir. It's just a matter of time. And so I really think that there needs to be a growing sense of alarm in the ag industry. People don't know where their food comes from. People don't know where their energy comes from, and they're making bad decisions as a result.
Our farmers really utilize and give great importance to the lower Snake River dams, the
Wonderful.
utilization of the Columbia Snake River system. Can you share with us maybe some pros about the lower Snake River dams with regard to the Columbia Snake River system, barging, hydropower, and do these pros outweigh any of the cons that you see?
I mean, I'm pretty clear on this on my channels about how I feel about the pros of dams. There's always going to be cons. There's always going to be cons. I'm going to switch gears for a moment and talk more about the energy side of things. You know, regardless of how you feel about climate change action and climate change legislation, let's just assume for a moment that putting CO2 into the atmosphere is a bad thing. If you believe that, then you automatically have to be in favor of clean hydropower, because dams don't destroy rivers, they borrow them. 1,000 years from now, a lot of these dams will be long since gone. You won't even be able to tell anything was there. And yet the deep strip mining up in Canada to pull out all that tar sand, I mean, that'll be there till the end of time. We are not looking at permanent impacts on the environment. We're looking at a temporary harnessing of energy. And so if you believe, like I do, that climate change is real, you pretty much have to be on team hydropower. There's a lot of people who are walking in inconsistency with that, because that is a huge pro that a lot of people don't put a lot of stock into. They have peddled the myth that hydro and wind energy are somehow interchangeable. What a lot of people don't know is that they actually have a symbiotic relationship, because the wind farms come online, then go offline. They fluctuate with the weather. The hydro system actually has to load balance them. So for every wind farm you build, you have to have a dam nearby, standing by, to help load balance the current. It's a very little known fact. And right now there's legislation being put out proposing that we dismantle the dams and build an equivalent amount of wind power, which anyone who works in electrical engineering will tell you does not work. But we don't have enough electrical engineers in Congress. The pros are too many to list. I would say the most overarching one is just the development of this river highway. The East Coast has hundreds of developed rivers. That's part of why the North American development was so successful, and why we've been so safe militarily as a nation. We have all these harbors, we have all these rivers, we can move goods and services. There are only 2 river highways on the entire West Coast. There's the Columbia Snake System, and then there's the Sacramento River. That is a resource that is underutilized. If you look at what they do back east and what they do in the Midwest, you know, the Great Lakes, the Ohio River, the Mississippi Missouri system, like this is an asset that is how we ensure sustainability, both environmentally and economically, for the next century. It would be crazy to tear this down right now. Other countries around the world are desperately trying to build what we built back in the 30s and 40s. Right? It would just be crazy for us to give that up.
Adam Young, you have a question, and while you're unmuting your microphone, Adam Ratliff, this gets very confusing, especially if I don't want to call you by the wrong name, which I did a minute ago. So talk about quickly, what is the monetary efficiency, I guess, of the river system backing up wind energy? Is it more expensive to adjust the rate from the river, or do we not really see a price differential there?
Oh, the price differential is enormous, and it's also very complex and hard to model. The best analogy I've thought of is, who here drives a pickup? Okay, how many horsepower is in your F-150 or in your Chevy, whatever? Just throw out a number. Somebody, how many horsepower in your engine?
You caught us. I've got a Ram 1500, but I don't know what the horsepower is.
I'm not a truck guy, so I don't know. Is it 700? Is it 500?
I don't know, honestly.
Let's just say it's 500. Let's just say it's 500. Okay. What would you do if someone came up to you and said, hey, you can't drive your 500 horsepower pickup anymore. Instead, here's 500 horses. That's equivalent, right? On paper. That's essentially what we have with wind, solar versus hydropower. Hydropower can be turned on at the push of a button, and it can be throttled with minimal wear and tear to the system. Whereas with wind and solar, you are dependent on the weather. And so, and there is not enough lithium in the Earth's crust to build a battery system that would be able to load balance that organically. So wind is great because it's free and it doesn't put any carbon in the atmosphere. Solar, I mean, we wouldn't have spacecraft if we didn't have solar. So there is a place for these quote unquote renewables, but they're not dispatchable, right? You can't turn them on when you need them. And so on a practical level, it doesn't matter what pencils out on paper, right? You know, like in the real world, you need a pickup to be able to work your land, right? Having access to 500 horses does not help you in what you need to do. And so there's some people who don't understand power systems who have done some back of the envelope math and said, if we get every federal subsidy, if we take advantage of every coupon we can, and if we, do some fancy accounting, we can get the equivalent amount of wind and solar to offset the dams. Well, the problem is they snapshot the dams at their lowest capacity, and they snapshot the wind and solar at the highest. So there's a lot of creative accounting going on there. But then even if you were to do that, it would not come close to being economically viable. And certainly in the heat of summer, when everyone turns on their air conditioner at once, you need power that you can turn on and ramp back down. You can't just wait for the sun to come out if you want to run your air conditioner.
All right. Okay.
Can I give one more statement on that? That was a power system. Let's also talk about river transportation. There are people who are making a false equivalency saying that we can replace river transportation by just building more trains, more railroad tracks. And I'm a train guy. I love trains. Choo choo. That's awesome. But I also know how to do math, right? And we all know that they're just from a fuel efficiency, environmental cost, and cost, there's a pretty big jump between transporting stuff on trucks and doing large scale freight by rail. Well, you get that jump again if you go from rail to river transportation. And so I like to point out the hypocrisy of this value proposition. If you believe in the environment and you want to have a clean atmosphere and not put excess carbon, not only do you have to be in favor of hydropower, you also have to be in favor of river transportation, because it is the most environmentally conscious way to move goods, not just on the river, but around the world.
Okay, Adam, ask a question.
Thanks, Brittany. So I guess one question I have for you, Adam, there's an aspect to this that doesn't get talked about very much. And so I'm from the southeastern side of the state that you were mentioning, where we've been dealing with our water issues. We've been in a 20-year fight basically over water. It all came to a head this year and it gained national attention and traction. But this really has been brewing for a very long time, and it's going to continue to brew, who knows how long into the future. One of the aspects of the dams that does impact us is, as part of the Nez Perce agreement, we're required to send, I tried to find the number, but if I recall correctly, it's about 500,000 acre feet of water in years when the reservoirs are full up here, out of our reservoirs for flow augmentation to keep those dams operating. And so I guess I have a couple of questions. And the first is, well, I guess let me preface that with I guess a little bit of context. Our water fights down here are over anywhere between 200,000 to 400,000 acre feet of water on average each year. So a loss of 500,000 acre feet obviously is huge for us. If we were to have that storage back in our reservoirs, then that would theoretically end our water fights over on this part of the state. So I guess my first question is, do you have any kind of, I guess, has there been any research that can isolate and point out the effects that flow aug has on the salmon runs? Do we know if it's doing any good? Can we quantify that? And then I guess the other question, just from a policy standpoint, becomes how do we support these dams going forward, especially as the Nez Perce agreement's due to be renegotiated here in the next few years in a way that doesn't put us on the hook for all that water going out of our system, if that makes sense.
That's a really good question. It's a very complex question because honestly, it really comes down to the framing of the numbers. You can frame it however you like, right? And so here's an example. Part of the agreements in place right now for moving juveniles downstream is to spill water to increase the flows to push them downstream. The problem is the way they worded it, they said spill as in spillway, not overall flow. We know that the fish survive more going through the turbines than they do over the spillway. We could be running that water through the powerhouse, kill less fish, and generate more energy. But the way it's worded, it says we have to waste that water over the spillway and not generate power. You see what I'm saying? So there's a clumsiness with this process that frames the numbers and you get adverse outcomes. And I think there's a lot of that happening with the management of the basin. My big fear is that the new agreements with the tribes are going to overrule everything, and they're going to get supremacy on the water rights and then not know what to do with them. And we're going to see water sent downstream at times that don't make any sense. We're not going to see the salmon numbers move. And the only conclusion will be, well, we need to try harder and take even more of your water. You asked about studies, what's been done. Yeah, there's a lot of studies. Most of them are somewhat inconclusive or a lot of correlation rather than causation. The thing that hasn't been looked at is habitat, right? Habitat. We know that habitat is where these critters spawn. And so if we're not restoring habitat, their numbers aren't going to go up. And so the last thing we should do though is pit upper basin growers against lower basin growers. Like we all need to use the river. Unfortunately, there isn't really a legal mechanism in place right now to really look at that holistically, except to do it to the advantage of the tribes. And that worries me. I think that's a fight that needs to be brought up in the courts more, because the way things are going, I have a feeling that all of these standard water rights are going to get superseded in the next few years. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's very complex, and the wrong framing of the numbers is leading to the wrong outcomes. I think the solution here is for us to frame the facts in a way that shows the reality of the situation for agriculture and not just looking at one tiny piece of the puzzle.
Right. Well, I think that's well put. I appreciate the comments about not pitting the upper basin against the lower basin. And I think for us, that would be really key is if we could find a way that, you know, that this doesn't impact us the way it has been impacting us up until now.
Yeah. So I see a question in the chat from Matthew, likelihood of dams being breached at this point. Okay. So the first big dam breach in the Pacific Northwest was the two dams on the Elwha River out on the Olympic Peninsula. It took 30 years for the federal government to acquire that property, do all the studies, and finally tear them down in the late 2000s. The second big one was Condit Dam on the White Salmon River near Hood River, Oregon. That was a Pacific Core dam, a private dam. It took about 15 years for them to go through all the permitting and then actually blow the dam in, what was that, 2012, somewhere around there. They are currently working right now with Pacific Core to demolish 3 dams on the Klamath River in Northern California. And it took them, I think, about 7 years to go through that process. So you see what's happening here. There's tens of millions of dollars being spent just on public outreach to convince the public that it's in their best interest to tear these dams down. And the next one on the list is the Lower Snake. If good people don't start changing the narrative, I think it is very likely that we will see something come up either in, well, okay, this is being recorded. Who else is going to listen to this? Anybody? I got to be careful what I say here. Can you like, how wide is this going, Brittany?
We post it on our website and to our podcast platform, so it can.
All right, I'll couch this in broad terms. Okay, we just saw a deal that came out of the Biden administration that bypassed Congress that struck a deal with the tribes to build new power to offset the benefit of the dams. Now, if you look at the numbers, none of it makes sense. None of it actually offsets the power, but that's neither here nor there. They have effectively checked a box and said, we've taken care of the excuse of power, of power generation. If we get a second Biden term, I think you can expect a similar deal, except around transportation. So that will mean some sort of subsidy for rail upgrades, possibly a per ton subsidy to the growers to help offset costs that'll last maybe 5-ish years. It won't be enough. It won't actually do it, but they will, in the public mind, have checked that box. And then they go before Congress and say, let's breach the dams at the end of a second Biden term. If we get Trump 47, I don't think that changes that much. It just delays some of the legislation. They're still going to work on this in the background. So please don't hear this as a partisan call to vote. It's not. Like, either way, the people who are advocating for dam breaching, they are playing the long game. And I fear that many of the people on Team Sanity have been playing checkers while Team Breach has been playing chess. They are after this for the long haul. And so if we do nothing, I think we could see something in front of Congress as soon as in the next 3 to 4 years. And when I say in front of Congress, I don't mean a bill that will go on the floor that will get debated over and over again and be on CNN. It will probably be a rider that's slipped into a larger piece of legislation, like an omnibus bill, and it'll get passed without anyone noticing. Here's a fun little fact. Student loan crisis, major thing that everyone knows about, everyone's concerned about. We created this problem so we can solve it. In the late 2000s, or was it early 2010s? A law was passed that federally guaranteed all private student loan debt. And when that happened, the amount of student loan debt quadrupled in the next few years because they federally backed it up. Does anyone remember when that law was passed? The law that almost single-handedly created the student loan crisis. Anybody remember that passing Congress? Nope. It was a rider in the Affordable Care Act. It was slipped through as a rider in Obamacare and nobody noticed. There was a blurb in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I was working for Washington State University at the time, and nobody talked about it. One of the most consequential pieces of financial legislation ever be passed and nobody noticed because it was slipped through a different issue. That's how dam breaching will be done. It'll be slipped through. It'll be a bargaining chip, right? You know, in exchange for breaching the dams, we'll let you, I don't know, build a diesel plant somewhere, you know, something, right? Some political football. So I feel a sense of urgency. I really do. I think that we are in danger of losing working infrastructure that has a dramatic effect on the environment and the economy if we don't help shape the narrative.
And one last question.
You got me fired up. This is something I'm very passionate about.
That's good. We like that. So, and that really ties into this question. So we talk about dams so much that people, I think, are getting fatigued from the topic. We keep talking about it, stuff keeps happening, but it seems like nothing's really happening. And do we need to keep having this conversation over and over? The answer to that question is yes, like you just said, but how do we make sure that we don't get passive, that we don't get complacent, and that this topic doesn't get stale and kind of shoved into the back of the closet when we need to keep people passionately engaged in this issue?
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of thoughts about this because I'm a filmmaker. I make documentaries, and I'm thinking about how to connect with an audience. And I think the missing component here really is that a lot of the Save Our Dams narrative has come across to the public as self-serving, right? The opposition has successfully convinced the public that they would be better off without these dams, and that the dams single-handedly got rid of the fish. Actually, the Biden administration just came out with a report last week, essentially saying that. Again, part of laying the foundation to future dam removal. But when we get out there and say save our dams, it's been a defensive strategy. It comes across as defensive, and people have a suspicion around big agriculture, and I put that in quotes because, as we know, big farms are family farms too. And so I think as we change the narrative, we have to go from defensiveness and, you know, saying, we need to stop saying take away the thing that benefits me and say, let's not tear down the thing that benefits all of us. This isn't just about saving our family farms. This isn't just about saving the growers. This is about food security. This is about energy independence. This is about decoupling from fossil fuels. This is about creating a more sustainable, environmentally conscious future for all of us, and the dams are a part of that. And being willing to use that language that is more centrist is something that a lot of us in the community aren't used to. And yet, you know, I know that I can get into a room with all my neighbors out here who are in ag, and there's not gonna be a single person who wants to tear out the dams, right? I'm preaching to the choir, right? Then there's the other end of the spectrum where, I mean, they would really love it if we went back to a time when there was no electricity and no development and no petrochemicals, and they would love that. I can't convince them either. But there's this enormous moderate middle, most, you know, your neighbors, your friends, the people that you go to church with, who are, you know, they have thoughts about this. They want a clean environment. They like salmon, but they also really like low taxes. And, you know, like, there's a lot that could be done if we aimed our attention at educating the moderate middle of the Pacific Northwest and not just preaching to the choir.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking your time to spend it with us today and talk about this important issue. And more importantly, thank you for all that you do on social media and through videos and all of that to educate the general public. We appreciate that. We realize that we fall short in that area a lot. So we appreciate all of your efforts.
Now, you're welcome, and we'll stay in touch. And if there's ways that we can collaborate in the future, please let me know.
Absolutely. All right. Like I said earlier, this episode is recorded. It will be posted to idahowheat.org. It will be posted to our YouTube channel and our podcast channel, both of which can be found at Idaho Wheat, or you can just go to our website and find both the YouTube link and the podcast link. If you want to share this with your friends and neighbors, and please do, feel free. And we will see you for our next From the Field, when we'll be talking about talking with Paul Arrington from the Idaho Water Users Association about the curtailment. So another one you don't want to miss. It's the summer of water here in Idaho. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam.
You guys have a great day. Thank you.